He was 17 years old, standing in the doorway of a back room in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, on the night of July 14th, 1881. The room was dark. The lamps had been turned down, and the man waiting for him in the shadows had been hunting him for the better part of a year. The boy had a Colt in one hand and a butcher knife in the other. What he did not have that night was the rifle he had carried in every photograph anyone had ever taken of him. A lever-action Winchester, model of 1873, chambered in .44 caliber, the most reliable repeating rifle in the United States of America, and maybe, just maybe, the only thing in the world that could have kept him alive. What does it mean when a single tool, a thing of iron and walnut and brass, decides who lives and who dies on a continent? This is the story of the Winchester Model of 1873. And this is the story of how a manufactured object, stamped out by underpaid workers in a Connecticut factory, came to be called the gun that won the West. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives, where we tell the true stories of the people, the places, and now the things that shaped the American frontier. If you find yourself drawn to history told with care and grounded in the record, take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. And while you are here, leave us a comment. If you had to ride into the open country in 1880, with only one rifle on your saddle, which one would it have been? And why? We read every answer. Now, to the story. To understand what the Winchester Model of 1873 meant, you have to understand what came before it. You have to stand on the American frontier in the years just after the Civil War and look at what an ordinary man or an ordinary woman had in their hands when something tried to kill them. Most of them had a single shot. That was the reality. From the colonial musket all the way through the great armies that bled themselves white at Antietam and Gettysburg, the standard weapon of every soldier, every settler, every hunter was a firearm that fired one bullet and then had to be reloaded. A muzzle-loading rifle in the hands of a trained Civil War infantryman might be fired 3 times in a minute by a man drilled hard and standing still on a parade ground. In a panic, in the dark, on horseback, on the open prairie with the wind in your face and your hands shaking, it might be fired once before the thing chasing you closed the distance. That was the math of survival on the American frontier in 1865. One shot, then a long, fumbling, terrifying pause, then perhaps another. The country itself was changing faster than the technology was. The transcontinental railroad was being driven across the continent by men working 16-hour days through the granite of the Sierra Nevada. Cattle drives were beginning to push north out of Texas toward the railheads in Kansas. Homesteaders were filing claims on the prairies of Nebraska and the Dakotas. Mining camps were exploding out of the dust in Colorado and Montana and the Black Hills. And every one of those people, every settler in a sod house, every cowboy on the open range, every prospector in a tent camp, every Lakota and Cheyenne and Apache warrior watching their world being taken from them, every Texas Ranger and territorial marshal trying to enforce a law that barely existed on paper, every one of them was living in a country where the gap between safety and disaster could be measured in seconds. And the difference between life and death was very often the number of bullets a person could fire before they had to stop and reload. A few inventors had been working on the problem for decades. As early as 1848, a man named Walter Hunt in New York had patented something he called the volition repeating rifle, a tubular magazine fed by a complicated arrangement of levers and linkages. It was, in concept, the ancestor of every lever-action rifle that would ever follow. It was also a mechanical nightmare, fragile and unworkable, and it fired a thing called the rocket ball, an early form of caseless ammunition in which the powder charge was packed into the hollow base of the bullet itself. The rocket ball was underpowered. It was unreliable. The rifle that fired it was almost never used. But the idea behind it, a rifle that held many cartridges in a tube and fed them one after another into the breech, did not go away. In 1849, a man named Louis Jennings purchased Hunt's patents and developed a slightly better version, manufactured in small numbers by Robbins and Lawrence of Windsor, Vermont, until 1852. Then two more men in Norwich, Connecticut, Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson, acquired the Jennings patent, and the shop foreman who had been making the rifles, a man named Benjamin Tyler Henry. Smith made improvements. In 1855, Smith and Wesson and a group of investors formed a corporation in New Haven called the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company to manufacture a lever-action pistol and rifle of Smith's improved design. The largest single stockholder in that company was a man who had never invented a gun in his life. His name was Oliver Winchester. Oliver Fisher. Winchester was not a gun maker. He was a shirt manufacturer. He had built his fortune in New Haven making men's dress shirts on a sewing machine he had helped to patent. He had a businessman's eye for opportunity, and he had quietly placed himself at the center of an industry that was about to change the way Americans armed themselves. When the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company failed and went bankrupt in 1856, Oliver Winchester bought up its assets from the remaining stockholders and, in April of 1857, reorganized the firm as the New Haven Arms Company. He kept Benjamin Tyler Henry on as plant superintendent. He told Henry to keep working on the problem of a reliable, self-contained metallic cartridge, the one component that everything else in the design depended on. By 1860, Henry had perfected a new round, the .44 Henry rimfire, a self-contained brass cartridge of unprecedented power for a repeating arm, and he had redesigned the rifle to use it. The result was the Henry rifle of 1860, manufactured by the New Haven Arms Company, sold to private buyers and to certain Union Army units in the Civil War. It was the first truly successful repeating rifle in American history. It held 15 rounds in a tubular magazine beneath the barrel and one in the chamber. A skilled shooter could empty it in less than a minute. The Confederates who faced it on the battlefield gave it the name that would echo down through every history of the weapon. They called it that damned Yankee rifle that they load on Sunday and shoot all week. After the war ended, Oliver Winchester renamed the New Haven Arms Company once more. From 1867 onward, it would be known as the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. And in 1866, that company released its first product under the new name. They called it the Model of 1866. The Frontier called it the Yellow Boy because its frame was made of a bronze and brass alloy called gunmetal that flashed in the sun like polished gold. It used the same .44 Henry rimfire cartridge, but the magazine had been redesigned with a loading gate on the side of the frame, and the wooden forearm was now fitted around a sealed tube. It was rugged, it was reliable, and it sold in numbers that made Oliver Winchester a rich man. But the Yellow Boy still had problems. The brass receiver was not strong enough to take a heavier powder charge. The .44 Henry cartridge, with its soft copper rimfire case, would sometimes split when it fired. And the rimfire design itself, where the primer was packed into the rim of the case, meant that once a cartridge had been fired, the case could not be reloaded. A man on the frontier who emptied his rifle had to come up with new cartridges from somewhere, somehow, before he could fight again. The men in the Winchester factory in New Haven knew all of this. They knew what their rifle could and could not do. And by 1873, they had been working for years on a new version of the weapon that would solve every one of those problems at once. A stronger frame, a more powerful cartridge, a reloadable brass case. A rifle that a man on the frontier could carry into open country, fire 15 rounds from as fast as he could work the lever, and then sit down in the evening by his campfire and reload his empty cases for the next morning. They called it simply the New Model of 1873. The country, in time, would call it something else. But before the rifle itself, you have to see the country it was about to enter. Because the Winchester Model of 1873 did not arrive in some quiet, peaceful America. It arrived in a country that was, by almost any honest measure, the most violent place in the industrialized world. In 1873, the year the rifle was introduced, the United States was still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War. A generation of young men had come home from the conflict, trained in the use of firearms and short on prospects. Many of them drifted west, hiring on as cowboys, soldiers, hunters, lawmen, or, in some cases, as the kind of men those lawmen were paid to chase. The Texas cattle drives had begun in earnest, pushing herds of longhorns north along the Chisholm Trail to the railheads at Abilene and Wichita, and, soon enough, Dodge City. The Northern Pacific Railroad was pushing across the Dakotas toward Montana, surveyed by men who in 1873 were already trading shots with Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who understood correctly that the iron rails would be the end of the buffalo country. The Black Hills, still by treaty Lakota land under the agreement signed at Fort Laramie in 1868, were a year away from the Custer expedition that would discover gold and detonate a war. The Apache Wars were grinding on in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. The Modoc War had erupted that very spring in the lava beds of Northern California. In Texas, the newly reorganized Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers was about to be commissioned to deal with cattle rustlers, Comanche raids, and a generation of Reconstruction-era outlaws. The financial panic of 1873 was tipping the country into a long depression that would drive even more desperate men west in search of work, land, anything. And in every corner of that violent, restless, expanding country, ordinary people were trying to live their lives. A homesteading family in Nebraska, with a sod house and a cow and a half-acre of corn, needed something on the wall above the door that could put meat on the table and stop a wolf from getting into the chickens. A trail driver on the Chisholm needed something he could pull out of a saddle scabbard if the herd stampeded or rustlers came up out of a draw at dusk. A territorial sheriff in Lincoln County needed something that would let him face down 3 men in a saloon without praying that his single shot would find a target. And on the other side of every one of those equations, on the side of the people being pushed off their land or hunted by the law, the need for the same kind of weapon was just as real and just as urgent. This was the country that the new model of 1873 was about to walk into, a country in which every man and many women lived with the daily understanding that the difference between getting through this week and not getting through it might come down to the speed and reliability of a single tool. The rifle Oliver Winchester's factory was about to put on the market would not invent that country. It would not start any war that was not already starting. It would not save any life that was not already in danger. But it would, in a way that nothing before it ever quite had, change the math. For the first time in the history of the frontier, an ordinary working man could afford to own a rifle that fired 15 times before it had to be reloaded, used a centerfire cartridge powerful enough to drop a deer at 100 yards, and chambered ammunition that would also fit into the revolver on his hip. For the first time, the math of a gunfight, an ambush, a hunting trip, a defense of a homestead would tilt by some small but real margin in favor of the person who carried a Winchester. Everything that followed, every legend and every tragedy that would attach itself to the rifle over the next half-century, began with that fact. 15 shots, one cartridge, one lever, and a country that was about to discover, for better and for worse, what that meant. The Winchester factory in 1873 was not a romantic place. It was a brick building on the banks of the Mill River in New Haven, Connecticut, 3 stories high, full of belt-driven lathes and milling machines and drop hammers and the constant deafening clang of metal being shaped into firearms. The men and women who worked there put in 11-hour days on weekdays, 10 hours on Saturdays, and earned roughly $600 a year. The air was thick with coal smoke from the boilers, oil mist from the machine tools, and the fine gray dust of iron filings that settled into the lungs of every person on the factory floor. There were no safety guards on most of the machinery. Hands and fingers were lost regularly. When a worker was injured badly enough to stop working, he was generally replaced by morning. This was where the new model of 1873 was being born. Not in some idealized workshop of frontier craftsmen, but in a noisy industrial cathedral of a Connecticut river town by people who would never themselves ride west, would never themselves pull the rifle from a saddle scabbard at sunset, would never themselves know the sound of the lever working in the silence of the high plains. They knew what the rifle was supposed to do because Oliver Winchester and his managers told them. They were paid to make it do that thing, reliably, thousands of times over. And they did. To understand what they were actually building, you have to understand the engineering problem that the previous Winchester rifle, the model of 1866, had not been able to solve. The 1866 was a beautiful weapon in its way, that bronze and brass yellow boy that flashed in the sun, but it was hostage to its cartridge. The .44 Henry rimfire that it fired was a rimfire round, meaning the priming compound that ignited the powder was packed into the rim of the brass case. To fire the cartridge, the firing pin struck the rim and crushed the priming compound between the metal and the powder charge. It worked. It had worked since the Civil War. But it had 3 problems that no amount of marketing could hide. The first problem was power. A rimfire case can only be made so thick before the firing pin can no longer crush its rim reliably. That meant the powder charge had to stay small. The .44 Henry threw a 200-grain bullet at something like 1,100 feet per second. It would kill a man at close range. It would not reliably kill a buffalo or a grizzly. It would not reach much past 100 yards with any kind of accuracy. And out on the open plains of the West, where the distance from the shooter to the threat could easily be 200 yards or more, that was a serious limitation. The second problem was the case itself. The soft copper of the .44 Henry rimfire case had a tendency to split when the cartridge was fired, especially in cold weather. A split case could jam the rifle's mechanism. A jammed rifle, on the frontier, was a piece of expensive, useless metal at the worst possible moment. Every cowboy and Texas Ranger and hunter who carried a yellow boy knew the feeling of working the lever and feeling it stick, knowing that somewhere inside the receiver, a torn piece of copper was caught in the action, and that the next thing you did would be to lay the rifle down and start picking the case out with a knife. The third problem was that a rimfire cartridge could not be reloaded. Once it had been fired, the rim of the case was crushed, the priming compound was gone, and the cartridge was finished. A man on the frontier who shot his way through a box of 50 .44 Henry rimfires had to find his way back to a town with a store that sold ammunition, or do without. There was no in-between. There was no sitting by the campfire and cleaning your empties and refilling them with powder and a fresh primer and a new bullet, because the design of the cartridge did not allow it. What Winchester needed, and what its engineers had been working on for years, was a centerfire cartridge, a round in which the primer was not packed into the rim of the case, but seated in the center of the base, in a separate replaceable cup. The advantages were enormous. A center fire case could be made of thicker, harder brass because it did not need to be crushed by a firing pin. It could hold a heavier powder charge. It could be fired in cold weather without splitting. And, most important of all, once it had been fired, the primer could be punched out, a new primer pressed in, the case refilled with powder, a new bullet seated on top, and the round was ready to go again. A man with a hand-loading tool, a supply of primers, powder, and bullets, and the patience to work at a campfire in the evening could shoot through the same 50 pieces of brass for years. The cartridge that Winchester developed for the 1873, and that was introduced in the same year as the rifle that fired it, was called the .44 Winchester Center Fire. The Frontier shortened the name. It became simply the .44-40, a 200-grain bullet of .44 caliber propelled by 40 grains of black powder, muzzle velocity around 1,200 feet per second. Slightly more powerful than the old .44 Henry rimfire, but not dramatically so. What it gave up in raw power, it gained back many times over in reliability and reloadability. The .44-40 would, within a few years of its introduction, become the most popular cartridge on the American frontier. Colt would chamber its single-action Army revolver, the famous Peacemaker, for the same round. Other revolver makers would follow. And the result, for any man who carried both a Winchester and a Colt, was a logistical revolution that ordinary people on the frontier understood immediately, and that historians have been writing about ever since. One ammunition pouch, one box of cartridges, one round that fit both the rifle in your hand and the revolver on your hip. In a country where the nearest store might be 3 days' ride away, where supply lines were thin and unreliable, where a man might find himself in a fight with whatever ammunition he happened to be carrying, that mattered. But the cartridge was only half of the puzzle. The other half was the rifle that had to be built to fire it. And here, the Winchester engineers made a decision that would define the weapon for the next half-century. They kept the basic action of the older Henry and 1866 rifles, the toggle-link lever action mechanism in which the working of the lever rotated a pair of linked steel arms that drove the breech bolt back and forth, was reliable and familiar and easy to manufacture. But they replaced the brass receiver of the Yellow Boy with a frame of iron, strong enough to take the higher pressures of the new centerfire cartridge. Beginning in 1884, 11 years into production, the iron frame would be replaced by steel, stronger still. They added removable side plates to the receiver so that a gunsmith or a careful owner could open the action and clean or repair the internal mechanism without breaking the rifle down. They added a sliding dust cover that rode on top of the receiver, sealing the action against the dust and grit that on the frontier could clog and jam any moving part of any tool you owned. The dust cover slid back automatically when the lever was worked, exposing the action only for the moment of firing and ejection, then sliding closed again when the lever returned home. The result, when it came out of the New Haven factory in the fall of 1873, was a rifle of remarkable refinement. The standard model, what Winchester called the sporting rifle, had a 24-inch round or octagonal barrel. The barrel could be ordered round, octagonal, or half-octagonal, depending on what the customer was willing to pay. A tubular magazine ran beneath the barrel from the muzzle back to the receiver, holding 15 rounds of .44-40 ammunition. A walnut stock and forearm fitted the iron frame snugly. The receiver could be finished in standard blue, or for the customers who could afford it, color case hardened in swirling patterns of blue and gold and brown that came from the heat treatment of the steel. The action was smooth. The lever worked with a satisfying mechanical certainty. The weight was about 9.5 pounds. The overall length in the rifle configuration was just over 4 feet. Winchester offered the model of 1873 in 3 main configurations. The sporting rifle, with its 24-inch barrel, was the most popular and the most widely sold. The carbine, with a shorter 20-inch round barrel, was designed for men on horseback. The carbine was lighter, quicker to bring up to the shoulder, easier to handle on a moving horse, and short enough to ride comfortably in a saddle scabbard along the rider's leg. It became, almost immediately, the rifle of cowboys, lawmen, and native warriors, the working tool of anyone whose life was lived from the back of a horse. The third configuration was the musket, with a 30-inch round barrel and a full-length wooden stock that ran almost all the way to the muzzle in the style of a military rifle. The musket was Oliver Winchester's bid to land a contract with the United States Army. That contract never came, for reasons that would matter a great deal at the Battle of the Little Bighorn 3 years later, and the musket would make up less than 5% of total Model 1873 production. But beyond those 3 standard configurations, Winchester would build a model of 1873 to almost any specification a customer was willing to pay for. The factory records, preserved today at the Cody Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming, show rifles built with barrels as long as 32 inches and as short as 12, octagonal barrels, half-octagonal barrels, pistol grip stocks of fancy checkered walnut, color case-hardened receivers, engraved scrollwork, gold inlay, silver inlay. A Texas Ranger named Peter Floke, captain of the 16th Regiment of the Texas Reserve Militia, paid $150 in 1876, nearly 3 times the price of a standard Model 1873, for a special order rifle that came out of the factory marked with 3 engraved words on the top of its receiver, 1 of 1,000. That marking, 1 of 1,000, was Winchester's own invention, introduced in 1875 to enhance the prestige of the rifle and the company. Every barrel that came out of the New Haven factory was test-fired. Those that produced unusually tight groupings during testing, the ones whose machined bores happened, by some combination of metallurgy and luck, to be just slightly better than average, were set aside. They were fitted to rifles with set triggers, special finishes, the best walnut the factory had on hand, marked 1 of 1,000, sold for $100, the equivalent of roughly $3,000 in today's money. A second grade of slightly less exceptional barrels were marked 1 of 100 and sold for $20 over the list price. In the entire production run of the Model 1873, only about 136 rifles ever received the 1 of 1,000 designation, and only 8 ever carried the 1 of 100 mark. Winchester's marketing department, even then, understood the power of scarcity. The country understood the appeal of owning the rifle that the factory itself called the best in 1,000. Production at the New Haven plant ramped up steadily through the 1870s. The first model of the 1873, with grooved guides on each side of the receiver to retain the dust cover, was produced from the initial run-up to approximately serial number 31,000. The second model, in which the dust cover rode on a single central guide rail secured to the receiver with 2 screws, ran from about serial number 31,000 to 90,000. The third model, in which the central guide rail was integrally machined as part of the receiver itself, was produced from then on through the great bulk of the rifle's production. By 1879, Winchester had introduced a smaller caliber version, chambered for a new round called the .38 Winchester Center Fire, or .3840. By 1882, a still smaller version, in .32 Winchester Center Fire, the .3220. And in 1884, Winchester would do something that no one had done before. They would chamber the model of 1873 for the small .22 rimfire cartridge. The .22 caliber Model 1873 became the first repeating .22 rifle ever sold in America. Approximately 19,000 of them would be made before that variant was discontinued in 1904. To load the rifle was a small mechanical ritual that thousands of men and women would come to know by feel, in the dark, with their eyes closed, after a long day on the trail. You held the rifle upright, butt down, the receiver against your chest. You pressed each cartridge, brass case first, against a spring-loaded gate on the right side of the receiver, just behind the barrel. The cartridge slid past the gate and dropped down into the tubular magazine beneath the barrel. You could feel the spring inside the magazine give a little as each new round pushed the others further down the tube. 15 rounds total. Then you brought the rifle down off your chest, worked the lever down and back up, which stripped the first cartridge from the magazine, lifted it onto the carrier, and slid it forward into the chamber. The hammer cocked itself as the lever returned home. The dust cover slid shut. The rifle was now ready to fire. To fire it, you pulled the trigger. To eject the spent case and chamber the next round, you worked the lever again. Down and up. The spent brass flipped out of the top of the receiver. The next round fed in. The hammer cocked. The dust cover closed. Down and up. Down and up. 15 times if you wanted. As fast as you could work the lever, as fast as you could pull the trigger. The mechanism never asked you to stop and think. It only asked you to keep moving. A skilled shooter, in good conditions, could empty a Model 1873 in something under 10 seconds. Even a beginner, after a few hours of practice, could fire all 15 rounds inside half a minute. To anyone whose previous frame of reference for shooting was a muzzle-loading rifle or a single-shot breech loader, this was something close to a miracle. The Winchester salesman who took the rifle to the frontier in the 1870s, traveling by rail and stagecoach to mining camps and territorial towns and military forts, would set up demonstrations in which they would fire all 15 rounds into a paper target at 25 yards, then turn the rifle over to a prospective buyer and let him do the same. The reaction was almost always the same. Men who had spent their entire adult lives with single-shot weapons would look at the rifle in their hands, then look at the target, then look back at the rifle and reach for their wallets. There was also the matter of the reloading. Oliver Winchester's son, William Wirt Winchester, who would die young of tuberculosis in 1881, leaving behind the wealth that would eventually build the famous Winchester Mystery House in California, had invented an all-in-one hand-loading tool to accompany the new 4440 cartridge. The tool was small enough to fit in a saddlebag. It allowed an owner of the Model 1873 to take a fired brass case, knock out the spent primer with a punch, seat a new primer in the base of the case, pour a measured charge of black powder into the case, seat a new bullet on top of the powder, and crimp the case mouth securely around the bullet. The whole operation took perhaps a minute per cartridge, once a shooter had the rhythm of it. Winchester sold the reloading tool through the same catalogs that sold the rifles and through general stores in frontier towns. A frontier shooter who carried the tool, a supply of primers, a tin of black powder, and a box of bullets could keep his rifle in ammunition almost indefinitely. The brass cases themselves, once fired, were the durable part of the system. They could be reloaded 10, 15, 20 times before metal fatigue made them unsafe. A single box of 50 Winchester brass cases in the hands of a careful owner could yield 1,000 or more shots over the working life of the rifle. The economics of the frontier rifle, which had been broken for decades by the difficulty and expense of resupplying rimfire ammunition, were suddenly something a working man could manage on his own. The price of a standard model 1873 sporting rifle through most of its production run was around $25. A carbine cost somewhat less. To a cowboy earning $30 a month, a Winchester represented nearly 4 weeks of wages. It was not a casual purchase. Men saved for it. Families saved for it. The decision to buy a Winchester was, for most working people on the frontier, a deliberate investment in a tool that they expected to outlast them, and very often did. The rifles that came out of the New Haven factory in the 1870s and 1880s would, in many cases, still be in working order a century later, hanging on the walls of grandsons and great-grandsons who had inherited them from old men who had carried them through the worst of the frontier years. The 1 of 1,000 grade, that elite designation of the most accurate rifles, deserves a longer look. The system was not pure marketing. Winchester really did test fire every barrel, and the variation in accuracy between barrels was real and measurable. The metallurgy of the iron and later steel used in the barrels was inconsistent in the 1870s. The boring and rifling machinery was precise within tolerances. But those tolerances varied just enough that some barrels, by good luck, would produce groups noticeably tighter than others. The factory test was conducted at 200 yards on a target with a 1-inch black bullseye. 3 shots were fired. The diameter of the resulting group was measured. Barrels producing groups under 3 inches at 200 yards were set aside for the 1 of 1,000 grade. Those producing groups between 3 and 4 inches were marked 1 of 100. The rest, the great majority, went into standard production. When Universal Studios in 1950 went looking for surviving 1 of 1,000 rifles as a promotion for the James Stewart film, named after the grade, they advertised in sporting magazines and put up posters in gun shops across the country. They found dozens. The rifles that came out of attics and barns and gun safes in response to those advertisements are today among the most valuable American firearms in existence. A documented 1 of 1,000, model 1873 in original condition, will sell at auction today for figures that would have been unimaginable to the working-class men and women who built it in New Haven in the 1870s. The rifle that Buffalo Bill Cody once personally presented to a 12-year-old boy named Robbie Campbell Adams, a deluxe factory-engraved Model 1873 short rifle, sold at auction in 2016 for $345,000. When the Model 1873 was finally retired from production in 1919, after 46 continuous years of manufacture, the New Haven factory had built approximately 720,000 of them. 720,000 rifles, carbines, and muskets in a country whose total population at the start of that production run had been around 40 million. There were enough Model 1873 Winchesters in the United States by the end for one to have been put in the hands of 1 out of every 55 Americans alive at the time of the rifle's introduction. It was the most widely owned repeating rifle the world had ever seen. But none of those numbers, on their own, explain anything. The Model 1873 did not win its name by being mass-produced. It won it by being carried into the hands of the men and women whose lives and whose violent deaths became the substance of the American frontier story. To understand the rifle, you have to follow it into those hands. And there is no better place to begin than with the man whose endorsement of the Model 1873, written by his own hand and printed in Winchester's catalog of 1875, would help to make both him and the rifle world famous. His name was William Frederick Cody. The country knew him as Buffalo Bill. William Frederick Cody was 27 years old in 1873, the year the rifle was introduced. He had already lived 4 lifetimes' worth of frontier experience. He had served as a Pony Express rider in his teens, scouted for the Union Army during the Civil War, hunted buffalo on contract for the Kansas Pacific Railroad to feed track-laying crews, and won the Medal of Honor in 1872 as a civilian scout in an Army engagement with Cheyenne warriors on the Platte River in Nebraska. By 1873, he was already a public figure. Eastern newspapers had begun calling him Buffalo Bill. The writer Ned Buntline had begun turning him into a dime novel hero. His fame was building, and Cody was a businessman as well as a scout. He understood, perhaps before anyone else of his era, the commercial value of his own name. When Cody first picked up a Model 1873, Winchester is not certain. What is certain is that by 1875, 2 years into the rifle's production run, he had used one on enough hunting trips and military scouting expeditions to form a strong opinion about it. In that year, he sat down and wrote a letter to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company in New Haven. The letter would become one of the most famous endorsements in American commercial history. "I have been using and have thoroughly tested your latest improved rifle," Cody wrote. "Allow me to say that I have tried and used nearly every kind of gun made in the United States, and for general hunting or Indian fighting, I pronounce your improved Winchester the boss." He went on in the same letter to describe an incident in the Black Hills the previous summer, when he had wounded a grizzly bear at long range, and the bear, instead of going down, had turned and come for him at a full charge. The bear, he wrote, was on him before he could think. He had time only to work the lever of the Winchester and fire again, and again, and again. The rifle, Cody wrote, had saved his life. He had killed the grizzly at the last possible moment, the animal close enough to touch when it finally went down. Whether the bear was exactly the size Cody described, whether the events unfolded exactly the way he remembered them, is impossible to know now. What matters is that Winchester reprinted the entire letter in the company's 1875 catalog. They put Buffalo Bill's name on the rifle, and Cody, in turn, would carry Winchester rifles for the rest of his career, including throughout the long touring run of his Wild West show, which by the 1880s and 1890s was the most popular live entertainment in the United States and Europe. Audiences in New York and London and Vienna would watch Cody and his sharpshooters fire glass balls out of the air with Winchester rifles. The brand and the man became inseparable, and the rifle, the new model of 1873, acquired through that association a kind of mythological weight that no marketing department could have invented on its own. But the endorsement of a single famous showman, however effective, was not what put the rifle into the hands of working men across the American West. What did that was a simpler and more practical reality. The rifle worked, the cartridge worked, and the men whose lives depended on their weapons noticed. In Texas, the Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers had been organized in 1874, the year after the Model 1873 was introduced. The state of Texas, recovering from the disorder of Reconstruction, had created the battalion to patrol the long western and southern frontiers of the state, to deal with Comanche and Kiowa raids out of the Llano Estacado, to break up cattle-rustling rings, to chase the kind of post-Civil War outlaw who had drifted south into the Texas brush country looking for work or for victims. The Rangers were a small force. At any given moment, the Frontier Battalion numbered only a few hundred men in total, spread across an area the size of France. They were paid poorly, equipped poorly, and expected to fight outnumbered against opponents who knew the country better than they did. What the state of Texas would not buy for them, many of them bought for themselves. A young ranger named James B. Gillett who joined the Frontier Battalion in 1875 at the age of 19, would later write that he purchased his Winchester Model 1873 out of his own pocket because no other rifle on the frontier could do what it did. Gillett would carry that rifle for 6 years of Ranger service, an estimated 10,000 miles on horseback across West Texas and into the territories. He used it in skirmishes with Apache raiders, in pursuits of cattle thieves, in the long, slow, patient work of pacifying a frontier that was, in those years, almost unimaginably violent. He survived. So did many of his comrades, and by the late 1870s, the Winchester Model 1873 had become, in everything but official designation, the standard rifle of the Texas Rangers. The Rangers were not alone in this. Across the territories, the same pattern repeated itself. Local sheriffs and deputies who were responsible for keeping order in towns that the federal government barely acknowledged bought Winchesters with their own money. United States Marshals serving in Indian Territory, that vast jurisdiction administered out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under the famously hard-handed Judge Isaac Parker, carried Winchesters as standard equipment when they rode into the lawless country between the Red River and the Kansas line. A man named Bill Tilghman, who would become one of the most famous lawmen of the Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s, was known to ride with both a Winchester Model 1873 in a saddle scabbard and a Colt Peacemaker revolver on his hip, both chambered in the same .44-40 cartridge. Tillman's partner, Heck Thomas, did the same. So did their colleague, Chris Madsen. The three of them, who became famous in Oklahoma as the Three Guardsmen, used Winchester 1873s on dozens of arrests and at least a handful of gunfights through the 1890s. The pattern was simple. A working lawman in the West by the late 1870s needed a rifle he could trust. He needed a rifle that would not jam in dust or cold. He needed a rifle that fired ammunition he could buy at any general store from El Paso to Cheyenne. He needed a rifle that he could share cartridges with the revolver on his hip. And he needed a rifle that, in the worst moment of the worst day of his life, when 3 or 4 armed men came up out of an arroyo at him or burst through the door of a cabin with murder on their minds, would not let him down. The Winchester Model 1873 met every one of those needs better than any rifle that had come before it. The men whose jobs put them in those moments again and again learned to trust it, and they passed that trust on to anyone who asked them what to buy. The same pattern, with the moral signs reversed, held on the other side of the law. The Winchester Model of 1873 was the rifle of outlaws as well as of lawmen, because the same advantages that made it the right tool for a sheriff made it the right tool for the man the sheriff was hunting. A bank robber needed a rifle that would fire 15 times before reloading just as much as a Texas Ranger did, and probably more, because the man with the badge could in theory call for reinforcements, and the man without one could not. The most famous outlaw of the entire American West, the young man whose photograph would become the most reproduced image of any frontier figure in history, would prove this point with his own life. Henry McCarty was born in New York City in 1859, almost certainly to Irish immigrant parents, whose exact circumstances have never been fully documented. He spent his childhood drifting through the country with his mother, ending up by his early teens in Silver City, New Mexico Territory, where his mother died of tuberculosis in 1874. The boy, alone, drifted into the kind of small-time theft and saloon floor violence that was the entry point of many young outlaws of the period. By his late teens, he had killed at least 3 men in disputed circumstances, had fled across territorial lines more than once, had been arrested and had escaped, and had taken on a new name. He was now William Bonney. The newspapers were beginning to call him Billy the Kid. In 1878, Billy the Kid was 19 years old and working as a ranch hand for an English-born cattleman named John Tunstall in Lincoln County, New Mexico. Tunstall was murdered that February by men working for a rival faction in what would become known as the Lincoln County War. Billy the Kid joined a group of Tunstall's other employees, calling themselves the Regulators, and embarked on a series of revenge killings that would, over the course of the next 3 years, make him one of the most famous and most hunted men in the United States. In every photograph that exists of Billy the Kid, in the only authenticated tin-type portrait of him ever made, in every contemporary description left by men who saw him alive, he is shown with a Winchester Model 1873. The rifle stood beside him in the photograph taken in Fort Sumner in 1880 that would, after his death, be reproduced in every newspaper in the country and on the cover of every dime novel about his life. The rifle was a Model 1873 carbine, chambered in .44-40. It had a 20-inch round barrel and a saddle ring on the left side of the receiver, the standard configuration of the working horseman's Winchester. The Kid had almost certainly stolen it or taken it from someone he had killed or acquired it through some other transaction that has not survived in the record. What is certain is that he carried it through every gunfight of the Lincoln County War, including the 5-day siege of the McSween House in Lincoln in July of 1878, during which the Kid and his fellow Regulators were trapped inside a burning building by sheriff's deputies and territorial militia and shot their way out through the smoke and the flames with their Winchesters and their Colts. The Kid survived the siege, so did his rifle. He continued to use it on the run through the next 3 years, killing more men, escaping from custody more than once, eluding the small army of lawmen that the territory of New Mexico had put on his trail. The lawman who eventually caught him in July of 1881 was a former buffalo hunter and bartender named Patrick Floyd Garrett. Pat Garrett had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County the previous November on a single-issue platform. The single issue was Billy the Kid. Garrett took the job, accepted the responsibility, hired 2 deputies, and set out to do what nobody else had been able to do. He hunted the Kid. Garrett carried a Winchester Model 1873 of his own. His rifle, by the time he finished his career, would be one of the most documented and most famous individual firearms in the history of the American West. A photograph survives of Garrett with his Winchester. The rifle itself, a well-used Model 1873 and .44-40 caliber that had been cut down to a shorter barrel at some point in its working life, would later be sold and resold by collectors. It still exists today. The hunt for Billy the Kid lasted 7 months. Garrett tracked the Kid through the backcountry of eastern New Mexico, ambushed his gang at a stone house at Stinking Springs in December of 1880, captured him, brought him to trial in the spring of 1881, and watched him be sentenced to hang. The Kid then escaped from the Lincoln County Courthouse in April, killing 2 of Garrett's deputies on the way out. Garrett went back out on the trail. On the night of July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett rode into Fort Sumner with 2 deputies, John Poe and Tom McKinney, on a tip that the Kid was hiding there in the home of an old friend named Pete Maxwell. Garrett went into Maxwell's bedroom alone, in the dark, hoping to question Maxwell about the Kid's whereabouts. He sat down at the foot of Maxwell's bed and began to talk. While he was talking, in the doorway behind him, a figure appeared. The figure was holding a Colt revolver in one hand and a butcher knife in the other. He had come, apparently, to cut a piece of meat from a side of beef hanging on Maxwell's porch. He spoke. "Quién es?" he said. "Spanish. Who is it?" The Kid, that night, was not carrying his Winchester. Whether he had left it in the room he had been sleeping in, whether he had set it aside when he went out to cut the meat, whether he had simply not bothered to pick it up because he believed himself to be safe in Maxwell's house, has never been established with certainty. What is certain is that he stepped through the door into Pete Maxwell's bedroom that night without a rifle in his hands, and that Pat Garrett, sitting on the bed in the dark, drew his pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck the kid just above the heart. He was dead before he hit the floor. The Winchester that had been in every photograph he had ever posed for, the rifle that had been beside him in every fight he had survived since the Lincoln County War, was not in his hands at the moment that killed him. Pat Garrett rode out of Fort Sumner the next morning with the kid's body in a wagon and the kid's reputation in his pocket. He would later write a book about the hunt, ghost-written by a friend, that turned both himself and his target into permanent fixtures of American mythology. The rifle, the Winchester Model 1873 that Billy the Kid had carried for the last 3 years of his life, vanished into the chaos of the night and the looting that followed. Whether it survives somewhere today in some private collection on the wall of some museum where no one has ever quite been able to authenticate it is unknown. What survives, and what is documented, is the photograph. The single tintype of Billy the Kid, standing on a wooden boardwalk in Fort Sumner around 1880, his Colt revolver in a holster on his hip, his Winchester Model 1873 carbine standing upright beside him with its butt on the boards and his hand resting on the muzzle. The image has been reproduced more times than almost any other photograph from the 19th century. The rifle in it, the same model that came off the production line in New Haven that year by the thousands, is part of the visual language of the American West. To picture Billy the Kid, in the imagination of any American who has heard his name, is to picture him with his Winchester. For all the stories that attach themselves to the Winchester Model 1873 in the hands of Buffalo Bill, the Texas Rangers, Billy the Kid, and Pat Garrett, the most consequential single battlefield in the rifle's history was a small ridge above a winding river in southeastern Montana Territory on the afternoon of June 25, 1876. The battle that took place there has been written about more than perhaps any other military engagement in American history. It has been called Custer's Last Stand. The Lakota and Cheyenne who fought there called it, and still call it, the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The Army called it, and the history books would settle on, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. What concerns us here is not the entire history of that battle, which has filled libraries and remains in many of its particulars genuinely disputed. What concerns us is the rifle, and the role the Model 1873 played in what happened on that ridge. To understand it, you have to start with a piece of bureaucratic irony that has never quite stopped being painful to read about. In 1872 and 1873, the United States Army Ordnance Department conducted field trials of 89 rifles and carbines looking for a new standard service weapon to replace the worn-out Civil War muzzle loaders that the Army was still issuing in some places. The trials included entries from Peabody, from Spencer, from Remington, from Sharps, from a German designer named Mauser, whose work would later define the bolt-action rifle for half a century. They also included entries from Winchester. Winchester submitted versions of the model of 1866 and the model of 1873, both lever-action repeaters, both capable of firing 15 rounds without reloading. The Ordnance Board, made up of senior officers whose military experience had been formed in the Civil War, rejected the repeating rifles. They cited several reasons. The rounds the repeating rifles fired, the .44 Henry rimfire and the .44-40 centerfire, were less powerful than the heavy single-shot cartridges the board preferred for military use. The repeating action was, they argued, more complex. and therefore more prone to mechanical failure in the field. And, in a piece of reasoning that would matter enormously, they argued that soldiers issued repeating rifles would waste ammunition by firing too quickly, exhausting their supply of cartridges before reinforcement or resupply could reach them. The board's experience was of large-massed infantry formations fighting other large-massed infantry formations. They did not, in 1873, fully appreciate that the war the Army was about to fight on the Great Plains would be a war of small mobile engagements against fast-moving mounted opponents whose entire tactical doctrine was built on concentrated firepower at close range. The board chose, instead of any of the repeating rifles, a single-shot breech-loading rifle called the Springfield Model, 1873. It was a sturdy and accurate weapon. It was also called by everyone who handled it the trapdoor Springfield because the breech opened by means of a hinged block that flipped up and forward like a trapdoor. To reload, a soldier had to work the breech open, eject the spent cartridge by hand or with a small lever, insert a new round, close the breech, cock the hammer, and aim. A skilled trooper could fire perhaps 12 to 15 rounds in a minute under good conditions. The Springfield carbine, a shortened version for cavalry use, was issued to the United States Army's mounted regiments beginning in 1874, including the 7th Cavalry, including the 5 companies of that regiment that George Armstrong Custer would lead onto the high ground above the Little Bighorn River 2 summers later. Custer's command at the Little Bighorn carried Springfield trapdoor carbines and Colt single-action Army revolvers. They had been issued no repeating rifles. They had been told by an ordnance board that had never seen the country they were riding into that the single-shot Springfield was the better weapon. Whether that decision contributed materially to what happened to them is a question that historians have been arguing about for almost 150 years. What is certain, and what has been confirmed by archaeological surveys conducted at the Little Bighorn battlefield since the 1980s, is that some number of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who killed Custer and his men were carrying Winchester Model 1873 lever-action repeating rifles. They had been able to acquire what the United States Army had refused to issue. How they had acquired them is a question with several answers. Trading posts, licensed and unlicensed, had been selling firearms and ammunition to native customers on the northern plains for years. Some of the rifles came from white traders working legally under federal licenses in the long stretches between the periodic crackdowns that Washington imposed and then forgot about. Some came from the unregulated trading post operations that flourished in the borderlands of Indian Territory and along the Missouri River. Some came from individual sales by sympathetic settlers, by miners, by soldiers who had been bribed, by gun runners who saw a market and supplied it. Some had been taken from the bodies of soldiers and civilians killed in earlier engagements, going back to the Fetterman fight of 1866 and through the long string of clashes that the Army called the Powder River campaigns. The federal government, in the years leading up to the Little Bighorn, had passed laws against the sale of repeating arms to native nations on the northern plains. It had not, as the historian Lee Noyes documented decades later, ever successfully prosecuted anyone under those laws. The rifles flowed, the ammunition flowed. By the spring of 1876, the warriors gathering on the Little Bighorn had access to a wider range of firearms than the Army had imagined. Recent archaeological work at the battlefield, conducted by Douglas D. Scott, Richard A. Fox, and others beginning in the 1980s, has identified spent cartridge cases from at least 8 different Winchester Model 1873 rifles used by the warriors who fought there. Cases from Model 1866 Winchesters have also been identified, along with Henry rifle cases, Spencer cases, and Sharps cases. In total, the analysis of fired cartridges and recovered bullets has suggested that the warriors fighting Custer's 5 companies were armed with at least 47 different types of firearms, ranging from old muzzle-loading muskets and trade guns to single-shot Sharps buffalo rifles to the most modern repeating Winchesters of the era. The picture, drawn from the metal that survived in the ground, is more complicated than either the Army's official reports of the battle or the popular mythology of Custer's last stand has ever fully reflected. It is important to say, clearly and without dramatization, what the archaeological evidence does and does not show. It shows that the warriors who killed Custer's command were not, as some accounts suggested for many decades, armed almost entirely with bows and arrows and obsolete muzzle loaders. They were not. A significant minority of them carried modern repeating rifles, including the Winchester Model 1873. It also shows, just as clearly, that the great majority of warriors at the battle carried bows, lances, single-shot rifles of various kinds, or weapons captured earlier in the engagement from the soldiers themselves. The picture is one of mixed armament, with the Winchesters and Henrys in the hands of perhaps a few hundred of the estimated 1,500 to 2,000 warriors present. What that mixed armament meant in the actual moments of the battle was a tactical reality the Ordnance Board had not anticipated. At certain points on the ridge that afternoon, in certain firefights between small knots of soldiers and small groups of warriors, the soldiers with their Springfield trapdoors were being engaged by opponents who could fire 10, 12, 15 rounds in the time it took the troopers to fire one. Major Marcus Reno, who survived the battle in the southern part of the field, would testify under oath at the subsequent court of inquiry that the warriors he fought were armed with Winchester rifles. Reno's officers, Lieutenants Charles Varnum and Charles DeRudio, said the same. Other survivors said similar things. Private Charles Windolph of Company H, looking back on the battle decades later, gave perhaps the most measured assessment, estimating that about half the warriors had carried bows and arrows, about a quarter had carried various older single-shot rifles, and the remaining quarter, the worst quarter for the soldiers to be facing, had carried repeating rifles like the Winchester. The Montana pioneer Granville Stewart, writing in a letter to Winchester some years later, looked at what had happened at the Little Bighorn and rendered the kind of verdict that frontier men of his generation rendered. If poor Custer's heroic band had been armed with these rifles, Stewart wrote, they would have covered the earth with dead Indians for 500 yards around. The judgment is brutal in its phrasing, reflective of its era in ways that are uncomfortable to read today, and almost certainly an overstatement of what better rifles alone could have accomplished against the overwhelming numerical disadvantage that Custer's command faced. Custer divided his forces against advice. He attacked a village whose size he had not properly scouted. He sent his 3 battalions in 3 different directions without effective communication between them. He was, in every meaningful tactical sense, defeated before the first shot was fired. The rifles his men carried or did not carry would not have changed the outcome, but they may have changed the cost on both sides of the outcome that did occur. What is certain, what cannot be argued with, is the symbolism. The United States Army went into the Little Bighorn carrying single-shot Springfield Model 1873 carbines issued by an Ordnance Board that had specifically rejected the lever-action Winchester Model 1873 from consideration 3 years earlier. Some of the warriors who killed them carried the Winchester Model 1873 that the Army had refused to buy. The rifle that had been judged too modern, too complex, too profligate with ammunition for the United States Army to issue to its soldiers was, In the hands of the men, those soldiers had been sent to fight, a contributing factor in one of the worst defeats the Army had ever suffered on the American continent. After the battle, several of the Winchesters recovered from the field were taken into private hands. One of them, a Model 1873, acquired some years later by a man named Moses Welch, a blacksmith and engineer working at the Blackfeet Agency in Montana Territory, came with a family letter that described it as having been surrendered by a warrior who had been present at the killing of Custer. The rifle survives. It has changed hands at auction more than once. It is one of perhaps a few dozen Model 1873 Winchesters that can be tied, by reasonable provenance, to the warriors who fought on the greasy grass that afternoon. The Little Bighorn was not the only place where Winchester Model 1873 rifles were used by native warriors in the long string of conflicts that the Army called the Indian Wars. Lakota and Cheyenne fighters continued to carry Winchesters through the remainder of the Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877, including at the Battle of the Rosebud and in smaller engagements that have been less remembered. Nez Perce warriors under Chief Joseph carried Winchesters during the long fighting retreat across Idaho and Montana in 1877. Apache warriors under Geronimo and other leaders carried Winchesters, including Model 1873s and the more powerful Model 1876 that succeeded it, throughout the Apache Wars in Arizona and New Mexico through the 1870s and 1880s. A photograph that survives from the era taken near the end of the campaign against him shows Geronimo kneeling in front of 3 of his warriors. 2 of those warriors are holding Winchester lever-action rifles. One of them, by the visible silhouette, is a Model 1873. To say all of this, plainly and without celebration, is to acknowledge that the same rifle which armed the Texas Rangers, the United States Marshals, the cowboys, the homesteaders, and the lawmen of the American West also armed the men and women who fought, with what tools they could acquire, against the dispossession of their nations. The rifle did not choose sides. It was a tool. It went where the money and the trade and the violence carried it, and in the hands of every faction in the long, terrible conflict over who would control the land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean, it killed people. Some of those people were heroes by anyone's measure. Some were criminals by anyone's measure. Most were, like most people in most wars, somewhere in between, doing what they thought they had to do, with the tools they had managed to acquire, in a country that had not given any of them a better choice. Away from the famous battles and the celebrated outlaws, the Winchester Model 1873 was, for most of its working life, a deeply ordinary tool. It hung on the wall above the door of a sod house in Nebraska. It rode in the saddle scabbard of a trail hand, pushing cattle north out of San Antonio. It stood in the corner of a tent in a mining camp in the San Juan Mountains. It was kept under the bed of a railway agent in a station house on the Kansas Pacific. The famous moments of the rifle's history were the exceptions. The rule was the long, quiet, daily presence of the Winchester in the lives of the people who actually settled and worked and died on the American frontier. Consider the cattle drives. Between roughly 1867 and the early 1880s, somewhere between 5 and 10 million Texas Longhorns were pushed north along the Chisholm Trail and the later Western Trail to the railheads in Kansas. Each drive was a small mobile community, a trail boss, a cook with a chuck wagon, a wrangler in charge of the spare horses, 8 or 10 cowboys in the saddle, ranging in age from 16 to 40, drawing pay of about $30 a month. Each man was responsible for the safety of the herd and for his own. Each man carried in the late 1870s and into the 1880s some combination of a rifle and a revolver. The rifle, more often than not, was a Winchester Model 1873 carbine. The revolver, more often than not, was a Colt single-action Army. Both, more often than not, were chambered in .44-40 so the cowboy could carry a single type of cartridge in a single belt and feed it into either weapon as needed. The work was not the romantic work of dime novels. It was long hours in the saddle, in dust and heat and rain, eating biscuits and beans and beef from the same trail herd you were driving. The Winchester carbine spent most of those long hours in a saddle scabbard, butt forward, muzzle down and back, riding against the cowboy's left thigh. He took it out when he needed it. He needed it more often than the movies would later suggest. River crossings, where the herd might stampede, or where rustlers might be waiting in the cottonwoods on the far bank. Camp nights, when stray cattle had to be turned away from poisoned water, or when wolves came in close. The occasional encounter with men whose business was to relieve the trail boss of his herd. The occasional encounter with native riders whose business was something else again, and whose situation was, by the 1870s, growing more desperate every season as the buffalo disappeared and the open country narrowed. A cowboy did not necessarily fire his Winchester every drive. Many drives passed without a shot being fired in anger, but the rifle was always there, riding against his leg, the weight of 15 .44-40s in its magazine, and the certainty in his mind that if the worst happened, he had something in reach that would answer. Among black cowboys, who made up roughly a quarter of the trail crews coming out of Texas in those years, and whose contributions to the cattle industry have only in recent decades begun to be properly recognized, the Winchester was equally standard. A man named Nat Love, born into slavery in Tennessee in 1854, came west after the Civil War and worked the cattle drives for more than 20 years. In his autobiography, published in 1907, Love wrote at length about the rifles and revolvers he had carried, and his preferred weapon for nearly all of his working career was a Winchester Model 1873. He used it, by his own account, in pursuit of cattle thieves, in hunting, in self-defense, and in the occasional disputes of frontier saloons. Among women on the frontier, the rifle was just as common as the men's accounts often pretended it was not. Homesteading wives and widows on the Great Plains, single women on isolated claims in Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas, ranch women in Wyoming and Montana kept Winchesters in their cabins and learned to use them. The historical record is thinner here than for the men because women's accounts of frontier life were less often published and less often preserved, but where the record does survive, the rifle is in it. Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, the Wyoming homesteader whose letters were published in 1914 under the title Letters of a Woman Homesteader, wrote casually about hunting with her rifle and about teaching her young daughter to shoot. The rifle in question was almost certainly a Winchester. The women who married into the Texas Ranger families, the wives and daughters of frontier sheriffs, the school teachers and storekeepers in the remote towns of the New Mexico Territory, learned, many of them, to handle a Model 1873 in the same way that women in eastern cities learned to handle a sewing machine. It was a household tool. It was kept clean. It was kept loaded. And, when it was needed, it was used. On the outlaw side of the ledger, the names continued to accumulate through the 1880s and 1890s. Belle Starr, the Missouri-born outlaw who became famous in Indian Territory, carried a Winchester Model 1873 along with her Colt revolver. She was photographed with both in a posed studio portrait that circulated widely in the dime novel press of the period. Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in Utah Territory in 1866, used a Model 1873 in the early years of his career as a bank and train robber before transitioning, like many in his generation, to the more powerful Winchester Model 1892. The Wild Bunch, the loose confederation of outlaws Cassidy ran with through the 1890s, carried a mix of Winchester models, with the Model 1873 prominent among them in the early years. Henry Brown, the Kansas sheriff who turned outlaw and was lynched in 1884 after a failed bank robbery in Medicine Lodge, was killed by a Winchester Model 1873 in the hands of one of the citizens who took him out of the jail. Billy Wilson, a member of Billy the Kid's old gang, was eventually captured by Pat Garrett along with his personal Winchester Model 1873, serial number 47,629, just a few hundred numbers away from a second model rifle that survives in private collections today. Among lawmen, the list runs longer still. Bill Tilghman in Oklahoma, who carried his Model 1873 from his early career as a buffalo hunter through 3 decades of service as a deputy marshal and as the sheriff of Lincoln County, Oklahoma Territory. Chris Madsen, the Danish-born deputy marshal who served alongside Tillman as one of the famous 3 guardsmen of Indian Territory. Heck Thomas, the 3rd guardsman, who personally killed the outlaw Bill Doolin in 1896 with a shotgun but carried a Winchester for most of his other arrests. Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger who joined the force in 1906 and who would, almost 30 years later, lead the ambush of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow in Louisiana, kept Winchester rifles in his vehicle that day, along with the more modern weapons his Ranger detachment carried. Jeff Milton, the man who would later be honored as the first United States Border Patrolman, carried a Winchester Model 1873 in 4440 during his early service as a Texas Ranger in West Texas in the 1880s. In nearly every direction one looks, across the working life of the American frontier, from the introduction of the rifle in 1873 to the closing years of the 19th century, the Winchester Model 1873 appears, sometimes in the hands of the famous, more often in the hands of the unfamous, the working cowboys and trail bosses and homesteaders and small-town sheriffs and ordinary settlers whose names did not survive into history but whose lives did. It was the rifle of an era, and it was passed, like any tool that defines an era, from hand to hand and from generation to generation until it became something more than a tool. It became, by 1890, an artifact, a symbol, a piece of the country itself. No technology, no matter how successful, holds the frontier forever. The Winchester Model 1873 was, by the standards of the firearms world, a creature of its specific moment. The toggle link action that gave it its strength and reliability also limited the kind of cartridges it could safely chamber. The 4440, the 3840, the 3220, and the small 22 rimfire that came later were all what gunsmiths called low-pressure cartridges. They were perfectly adequate for the work that most owners of the rifle actually did, which was killing deer and antelope at moderate range, defending homesteads against predators and human threats, and the occasional close-quarters gunfight. They were not adequate, by the standards of the time, for the most powerful and increasingly fashionable big-game hunting cartridges of the late 1870s and 1880s. A buffalo hunter who wanted to drop a 1,500-pound bull at 400 yards needed something heavier than a 4440. A serious elk hunter needed something with more reach. And the Army, which had rejected the Model 1873 in 1873 for the Springfield trapdoor, was by the mid-1880s beginning to look at smokeless powder cartridges that the toggle-link Winchester action simply could not handle. Winchester knew all of this. The company had not become the most successful firearms manufacturer in American history by failing to anticipate the next change in the market. In 1876, Only 3 years after the Model 1873 was introduced, Winchester brought out the model of 1876, sometimes called the Centennial Model, in honor of the United States' 100-year anniversary that year. The 1876 was a heavier-framed version of the basic toggle-link design, capable of chambering more powerful black powder cartridges suitable for big-game hunting. It was, in many ways, a stopgap. It used the same fundamental action as the 1873, just scaled up. Its action was still too short, structurally, to handle the most popular big-game rounds of the day, including the famous .45-70 government cartridge that the Army was using in its Springfield rifles. Only about 63,000 of the Model 1876 were built before production ended in 1897. It was used by the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, which purchased 750 of them in 1883 as a standard arm. It was issued to some companies of the Texas Rangers. Theodore Roosevelt carried an engraved Model 1876 on his early hunting trips in the West and praised it in his writing. Geronimo, the Apache leader, was found in possession of a Model 1876 after his final surrender in 1886. But the 1876 never approached the commercial success of the 1873, and Winchester knew it needed a fundamentally new design. That design came from a young Mormon gunsmith from Ogden, Utah, whose name would, over the next 40 years, become as central to the history of American firearms as Oliver Winchester's own. His name was John Moses Browning. Beginning in 1883, Browning began a partnership with Winchester that would produce some of the most successful lever-action rifles ever made. The Winchester Model 1886, the Browning-designed rifle that finally gave the Winchester lever action a true big-game capability, came out 3 years into the partnership. The Model 1892, designed by Browning to use the same lower-pressure pistol cartridges as the Model 1873, but with a much stronger and more refined locking block action, was introduced in 1892 and would eventually sell over 1 million units. The Model 1894, also designed by Browning, became the most successful sporting rifle in American history and would sell over 7 million units before production ended in the United States in 2006. There is a piece of historical irony worth pausing on here. The United States Army, which had rejected the Winchester Model 1873 in 1873 in favor of the single-shot Springfield trapdoor, would not seriously reconsider its policy on repeating rifles until after the experience of the Spanish-American War in 1898. In Cuba, American troops carrying single-shot Springfields and a few bolt-action Krog-Jorgensen rifles encountered Spanish forces armed with bolt-action Mauser repeaters firing smokeless powder cartridges. The American soldiers, taking heavy casualties at engagements like the assault on San Juan Hill, learned in the worst possible classroom what the Ordnance Board had refused to learn in 1873. A repeating rifle in the hands of a determined opponent could pour out fire at a rate that single-shot weapons could not match, and the difference in the field was paid for in dead men. The Army adopted the Krog-Jorgensen as standard issue in 1892, then replaced it with the Mauser-derived Springfield model 1903 after the Cuba experience. The era of the single-shot military rifle in the United States came to an end 25 years late, and at a cost the Ordnance Board of 1873 had not been prepared to pay. What that meant for the Winchester Model 1873, looking backward from the end of the 19th century, was a curious historical position. The rifle had never been a military weapon in the sense the Army defined the term. It had not been issued to United States troops in any significant numbers. The muskets that Winchester had built specifically for military contracts, with their 30-inch barrels and full-length stocks, had sold mostly to foreign governments. The Model 1873's career as a fighting rifle had been carried out almost entirely in private hands by cowboys and lawmen and outlaws, by Texas Rangers buying their own equipment because the state would not, by native warriors trading buffalo robes for the rifle that the United States Army had refused to issue to its own troops. The Winchester Model 1873 won its reputation outside the chain of command in the rougher and less regulated world of the American frontier, where the question of what weapon worked best was answered not by an ordnance board, but by the people whose lives depended on the answer. The Model 1892 in particular eroded the Model 1873's market. The two rifles were sold side by side at the same price for more than 20 years. The 1892 was lighter, stronger, mechanically more refined. The 1873 was older, more storied, and to many buyers in the 1890s and 1900s, increasingly the rifle their fathers had carried rather than the rifle they wanted to buy themselves. Production of the Model 1873 slowed steadily through the 1890s. By 1900, the rifle's sales were a small fraction of what they had been at the peak in the 1880s. Winchester kept it in production because there was still a demand, particularly from older customers who knew and trusted the design, and because the tooling and the skilled workforce existed to keep building it. In 1919, after 46 years and 720,000 units, the company quietly discontinued the model. The last few rifles trickled out of the New Haven factory in the early 1920s, finishing off the unsold parts inventory. Official discontinuation was 1923. But before we leave the working life of the rifle, there is one chapter that deserves to be told because it tends to be left out of American accounts of the Model 1873, and because it reflects something important about what the rifle actually was. The Winchester Model 1873 was not only an American weapon, it was an export. Oliver Winchester's marketing department had been pursuing foreign sales from the very first year of the rifle's production, and by the late 1870s, the New Haven factory was shipping Model 1873s and the older Model 1866s to military and police customers around the world. The most consequential foreign deployment of a Winchester lever-action rifle in the 19th century took place not in the American West, but in Bulgaria. In 1877, during the Russo-Turkish War, an Ottoman army numbering about 40,000 men under the command of Osman Pasha occupied the strategic town of Plevna in what is now northern Bulgaria. The Russian army, attacking with vastly superior numbers, expected a quick victory. They did not get one. The Ottoman defenders, many of whom were armed with Winchester Model 1866 rifles purchased from the New Haven factory a few years earlier, repelled 3 separate Russian assaults with concentrated lever-action firepower at close range. The Russian dead, in some accounts, were piled 3 and 4 deep at the foot of the Ottoman trenches. The siege lasted nearly 5 months. When Plevna finally fell in December of 1877, the lessons of the battle were studied carefully by every European army staff. The repeating rifle, which the American Ordnance Board had rejected in 1873, had just demonstrated in dramatic and bloody terms what concentrated lever-action fire could do to massed infantry. Several European countries in the years that followed began to adopt repeating rifles of their own design. The Swiss Army selected a domestic copy of the Winchester tubular magazine, the Viterli, for its standard infantry rifle. The lesson that the United States Army would not fully internalize until the experience of the Spanish-American War in 1898 had been written in blood on the slopes outside of Plevna more than 20 years earlier. The Model 1873 itself was exported in smaller numbers than the older Model 1866, but it went out into the world. French military and police bought small quantities. Some made their way to Mexico, where they were used in the long sequence of civil wars and revolutions that ran from the 1870s through the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s. The Argentine government purchased Model 1873s. So did Brazil. The Imperial Qing Army of China, in a transaction not widely remembered today, purchased a quantity of Model 1873 muskets for its forces in the late 1870s and 1880s. A photograph from approximately 1880 survives that shows Qing soldiers in formal uniform holding the long-barreled Winchester muskets, the weapon's iron receiver and tubular magazine visible against the soldier's dark coat. The Model 1873 fought in one capacity or another on 5 continents. It served in the Russo-Turkish War, the War of the Pacific between Chile and its neighbors in the early 1880s, the Northwest Rebellion in Canada in 1885, the Mexican Revolution, and dozens of smaller conflicts. It was used by armies of nations and by guerrilla forces fighting against those nations. It was used by colonial powers and by the people resisting them. The American frontier was where the rifle made its name. But the world, in those decades, was full of frontiers, and the Winchester Model 1873 found its way into a good many of them. When the Winchester Model 1873 left the working life of the American frontier, it did not leave the country's imagination. If anything, the rifle's mythological life began only after its practical life had ended. The same decades in which the actual frontier was being closed by railroads, by barbed wire, by federal land policy, and by the slow administrative grinding down of the territories into states, were also the decades in which the United States began to look back at the frontier and turn it into a story. And in that story, the Winchester Model 1873 occupied a central place. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured for more than 30 years across the United States and Europe between 1883 and the 1910s, was perhaps the single most powerful engine in this mythologization. Cody and his sharpshooters, including the Ohio-born phenomenon Annie Oakley, performed live shooting exhibitions in front of audiences that reached, in some calculations, into the tens of millions over the course of the show's run. The rifles they used were Winchesters. The image of the lever-action Winchester being fired at glass balls thrown into the air by men and women in fringed buckskin and broad hats against the painted backdrop of mountains and prairie became, for a generation of Americans and Europeans alike, the visual definition of the American West. By the time motion pictures arrived in the early 20th century, that visual language was already established. The first generation of Western films, made before 1920, drew their costumes and weapons and props directly from the Wild West show tradition. The Winchester lever action, whether Model 1873 or one of its successors, was the rifle that the cowboy of the silent screen carried because it was the rifle that Buffalo Bill's cowboys had carried in the touring show. The talking pictures, when they arrived in the late 1920s and exploded into the Western genre through the 1930s and 1940s, only intensified the association. Every major Western star of Hollywood's golden age was photographed with a Winchester lever action at some point. John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Randolph Scott, Joel McCrea, Henry Fonda. The rifle they carried, in most cases, was actually the later Model 1892, because the Model 1873 was harder to find in working condition by the 1930s, and because the studio's prop houses had stocked up on the more available 1892. But the visual silhouette of the lever-action Winchester, with its long tubular magazine and its open lever, was unmistakable on a movie screen. To several generations of moviegoers, it became impossible to separate the rifle from the genre. The Winchester lever action was what a man on horseback carried in a Western. The genre defined the rifle, and the rifle defined the genre. In 1950, a film was released that took the relationship to its logical conclusion. The film was simply titled Winchester 73. It starred James Stewart, then 42 years old, in his first leading role in a Western. It was directed by Anthony Mann. The plot, which is more interesting in concept than in execution, follows a single Model 1873 Winchester, identified in the film as a 1 of 1,000 grade rifle that had been won in a shooting contest in Dodge City, as the weapon passes from hand to hand through a series of frontier characters. The rifle is stolen, it is recovered, it is lost again, it is carried by good men and by bad. By the end of the film, it is returned to its original owner, but the trail it has cut through the lives of the people who have touched it has left them all altered. The film is, in some sense, the first major American film whose central character is not a human being, but an object. And the object is the Winchester Model 1873. Universal Studios, in promoting the film, did something that was either a brilliant piece of marketing or a strange piece of cultural archaeology, depending on how one looks at it. The studio ran advertisements in sporting magazines and put up posters in gun shops across the country, announcing a search for surviving 1 of 1,000 grade Model 1873 Winchesters. Anyone in possession of such a rifle was invited to come forward. The studio offered to authenticate the rifle and, in some cases, to feature it as a publicity piece for the film's release. The response was substantial. Dozens of rifles emerged from attics and gun safes and dusty closets across the United States. Of the approximately 136 1 of 1,000 Model 1873s that had originally been produced, the studio's search located more than 20. Most of them had been sitting unused for decades, their original owners long dead, their existence forgotten by everyone but the families that had inherited them. The rifles that emerged in 1950 are today, when they come to auction, among the most valuable American firearms in existence. A documented original 1 of 1,000, Model 1873, in good condition with its provenance established, can sell at auction today for figures well into 6 and sometimes 7 figures. The James Stewart film did something else, perhaps more important. It established, for a post-war generation of Americans, that the Winchester Model 1873 had become the rifle. Not a rifle, the rifle. The phrase, "the gun that won the West," which Winchester had been using in its own marketing for decades, took on a kind of cultural authority that no marketing department could have achieved on its own. It became the way the country talked about its own past. It appeared in textbooks, in popular histories, on the walls of museums, in the speeches of politicians. The rifle, by 1950, was no longer simply a tool that had been used. It was an idea that had been used. And the idea was bigger, by then, than the rifle itself. That idea has proven remarkably durable. The Winchester Model 1873, having been out of production for 90 years, was brought back into manufacture in 2013 by the Olin Corporation, which owns the Winchester brand under license to Browning Arms, which contracts the actual manufacturing to the Miroku Corporation in the Kochi Prefecture of Japan. The new rifles are nearly faithful copies of the original 1873s, including the toggle link action, the sliding dust cover, and the crescent-shaped butt plate, with 2 modern safety modifications. A firing pin block prevents the pin from moving forward unless the trigger is pulled. A modified cartridge carrier ejects spent cases away from the shooter rather than back toward his face. The chamberings offered are .45 Colt, .44-40 Winchester, and .357 Magnum/38 Special. The magazine capacity is 14 rounds for the larger calibers and 13 for the rest. The price, in current dollars, for a new factory, Winchester Model 1873, is several times what the original sold for in equivalent purchasing power. They sell, nonetheless, by the thousands. Italian manufacturers, principally A. Uberti of Brescia, have been making faithful reproductions of the Model 1873 in even larger numbers since the 1970s, supplying the cowboy action shooting community that has grown into a substantial sporting hobby across the United States and parts of Europe. The rifle, the design that Winchester engineers worked out in New Haven in the early 1870s, is still being made in 2026. It is, in that sense, one of the longest continuously produced sporting firearms in history. Then, in 2014, the rifle gave the world one of its strangest and most evocative artifacts. A park ranger, conducting a routine survey in Great Basin National Park in eastern Nevada, was walking through a stand of juniper trees when he spotted something leaning against the trunk of one of them. The thing was weathered, gray, the wood split and bleached by decades of sun and wind. As he came closer, the ranger realized he was looking at a rifle, a Winchester Model 1873. The serial number, when it was later researched at the Cody Firearms Museum, dated the rifle to manufacture in 1882. It had been propped against that tree in that exact position for some unknown period of time, probably decades. The wood of the stock and forearm had weathered into something almost the same color as the bark of the juniper. The barrel was rusted but intact. The lever was still operable. The magazine, when it was carefully examined, was empty. No one has ever been able to determine who left the rifle there. No one has been able to determine why. The Forgotten Winchester, as it came to be called, sparked a brief flurry of media coverage and an outpouring of theories. A hunter who set the rifle down to do something else and never came back. A trapper, a prospector, a man fleeing something, a man hunting something, a man who simply died alone in a corner of the country where his body was never found. The rifle does not say. The park rangers and the firearms historians who have examined it can tell you with some precision when it was made and how it was used and what its mechanical condition was when it was found. They cannot tell you the one thing anyone really wants to know about it. They cannot tell you the story of the person who carried it last. In some way, that absence is the most honest legacy the rifle has. 720,000, Model 1873. Winchesters were manufactured in New Haven, Connecticut between 1873 and 1923. Some of them found their way into the hands of famous people whose stories survive. The great majority of them did not. They went out into the country and were carried by working men and women whose names were not written down, whose deaths were not recorded in any paper that survives, whose lives passed through the American frontier with the same brief and unrecorded weight that most lives pass through any frontier. The Forgotten Winchester, leaning against its tree in the high desert of Nevada with no one alive who can tell its story, is the truest monument to that fact. It is the rifle in the hands of the unknown. It is the 720,000 minus the few hundred whose stories were preserved. It is what the American West actually was, behind the dime novels and the Wild West shows and the James Stewart films. It is the silence under the legend. There is a question that hangs over the entire history of the Winchester Model 1873 and over the slogan that the company itself attached to the rifle that anyone who tells this story honestly has to face. Did this rifle, in fact, win the West? And what would that even mean? The phrase taken at face value suggests a clean and triumphal narrative. A rifle was invented. American men carried it into the wilderness. The wilderness was conquered, The country became great. The end. That is the story that Winchester's marketing department wanted to tell, and it is the story that several generations of textbooks and films and political speeches have repeated. It is also, like most clean stories, a substantial distortion of what actually happened. The West, in any meaningful sense, was not a wilderness. It was occupied land by native nations who had lived on it for thousands of years, and by Spanish-speaking peoples who had been there for centuries before the United States existed as a country. The process that Americans of the late 19th century called the settling of the West, and that we now more accurately call the dispossession of those native and Hispano communities, was a long, complicated, and often brutal historical event. It involved treaties signed and broken. It involved military campaigns. It involved disease, displacement, starvation, forced removal to reservations, the deliberate extermination of the buffalo to break the economy of the Plains nations, the breaking up of communal landholdings under the Dawes Act, the suppression of native languages and religious practices, and an entire administrative apparatus designed to absorb or eliminate the cultures that had been there first. The Winchester Model, 1873, was a tool used during that process. It was carried by soldiers and settlers and lawmen who participated in it on the American side. It was also carried in smaller numbers by native warriors who fought against it as long as they could. To say that the rifle won the West, then, is to say that a manufactured object played a role in a historical process that involved the dispossession of one set of peoples by another. That is a more uncomfortable sentence than the marketing version. It is also closer to the truth. The rifle did not invent the conflict. It did not start the wars. It did not draw the treaty lines that were so casually erased, but it was present at most of those events, in the hands of most of the people involved, and its effect was to make the violence of the period more efficient and more deadly than it might otherwise have been. A man with a Winchester Model 1873 in 1880 could do, in 2 minutes, what would have taken a man with a muzzle-loading rifle 20. That mattered on both sides of every fight. It mattered in the small, hidden, unrecorded engagements as much as it mattered in the famous battles. It mattered when a homesteader fired on a native rider crossing his claim. It mattered when a native warrior fired on a homesteader's wagon. It mattered when a Texas Ranger fired on a Comanche raiding party. It mattered when a Comanche raider fired on a Texas trail crew. The math of the rifle worked in every direction, and the result, across the West, was a body count that the country has never fully reckoned with. What the rifle did not do, and what no rifle could have done, was determine the outcome. The dispossession of native peoples on the American continent was not, in the end, decided by any individual weapon. It was decided by demographics, by industrial capacity, by the railroads, by the federal government's ability to put soldiers and settlers in the field in numbers that the native nations, decimated by disease and starvation and broken treaties, could not match. The Winchester Model 1873 was a participant. It was not the cause. The cause was older and larger and more diffuse than any rifle, and it would have produced the same outcome with single-shot muskets if necessary. The rifle simply made it faster and bloodier. This is the harder truth that the slogan, "The gun that won the West," was designed to obscure. The slogan suggests that something was won. What was actually accomplished, in the period when this rifle was the dominant repeating arm on the American frontier, was the transfer of a continent from one set of human beings to another. That transfer was not, by any sane moral accounting, a triumph. It was a conquest. The rifle was an instrument of that conquest in roughly the same way that the railroad was an instrument of it, or barbed wire, or the telegraph, or the Homestead Act. It made the project more efficient. It did not make the project right. And yet, having said all of that, the rifle was also something else. It was, for hundreds of thousands of ordinary working people on the American frontier, a tool that kept them alive. The homesteading widow on a Nebraska claim who used her Winchester to scare off a wolf that had been killing her chickens, the cowboy on a trail drive who used his to defend the herd from rustlers who would have shot him and left him in a ditch, the small-town storekeeper who used his to face down 3 drunk drifters trying to rob his till, the Texas Ranger who used his to survive an ambush in the Big Bend country, all of these people, in their individual moments, were not doing the work of dispossession. They were doing the work of staying alive in a country that did not provide them many other tools to do so with. The rifle did that work, and it did it reliably, for decades. The ordinary uses of the Model 1873 vastly outnumbered the famous ones. Most owners of the rifle in the entire course of its production never fired it at another human being. They fired it at game animals to put food on the table. They fired it at predators to protect their livestock. They fired it in target practice at tin cans on a fence post or at paper targets at a county fair. They cared for it, oiled it, kept it dry, passed it down to their children. The rifle was, for them, what any well-made tool is for the people who use it. It was a thing they trusted, and it served them. To hold both of those truths in mind at the same time, that the rifle was an instrument of historical violence and that it was a tool of ordinary survival, is harder than holding either one of them alone. The American mythology of the West has tended to embrace the second and ignore the first. The academic critique of that mythology has tended to embrace the first and dismiss the second. The honest accounting, the one the Winchester Model 1873 actually deserves, requires both. It requires looking at the rifle as it appears in the photograph of Billy the Kid and seeing both a young murderer and a young man fighting for his life. It requires looking at the rifle as it appears in the archaeological evidence from the Little Bighorn and seeing both a weapon that killed 268 United States soldiers and a weapon that, in the hands of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, briefly halted the destruction of their nations. It requires looking at the rifle as it appears in the hands of Buffalo Bill, of James B. Gillett, of Belle Starr, of Pat Garrett, of Geronimo, and seeing in every one of those hands a tool whose meaning depended entirely on what the person holding it chose to do with it. That is what an object is. In history, it is what every object is. The rifle did not have moral content of its own. It had a steel frame, a tubular magazine, a lever action mechanism, and a barrel of a certain length. What the rifle meant in any given moment was determined by the person holding it, and what it means now, in retrospect, is determined by us, by the stories we choose to tell about it, by the parts of those stories we choose to remember, and the parts we choose to leave out. If you walk today through the Cody Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming, you will pass display case after display case of Winchester rifles. Model 1866s with their bronze yellow boy receivers, Model 1873s of every configuration, in every caliber, with every variation of barrel length and stock and finish that the New Haven factory produced. Model 1876S and 1886S and 1892S and 1894S. Model 1895S and Model 70S and Model 94S. The collection is the most complete in the world, and it is housed in a building that bears the name of the man who, more than any other, made the Winchester rifle famous beyond its actual mechanical merits. William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill. In one of those display cases, behind glass that is checked daily and lit with a soft yellow light, sits the forgotten Winchester. The rifle that was found leaning against a juniper tree in Great Basin National Park in 2014 that had been standing there for perhaps 100 years, whose owner has never been identified and almost certainly never will be. The rifle has not been restored. The museum chose, deliberately, to leave it the way the park ranger found it. Weathered gray, splintered, the wood the color of the tree bark it had been leaning against, the metal red with rust. The lever still operable if you knew how to work it. The magazine empty. It is, in some ways, the truest exhibit in the building. Not the engraved 1 of 1,000 presentation rifles, not the documented weapons of famous lawmen and outlaws, not the Buffalo Bill presentation pieces or the Annie Oakley personal rifles. The forgotten Winchester, the rifle whose owner cannot be named, is closer to what the Model 1873 actually was across the half-century of its working life than any of the famous examples. It is the rifle of the person whose story did not survive. And the person whose story did not survive is, in any honest accounting of the American frontier, the typical person, the rule, not the exception. 720,000, Model 1873. Winchesters left the New Haven factory between 1873 and 1923. Most of them have been lost. Some have been destroyed in the routine attrition of a century. Some have been dismantled for parts. Some have been buried with their owners in graves whose locations are no longer known. Some are still out there. They turn up at estate sales and in antique shops and at auctions and, occasionally, propped against a tree in a national park where someone left them and never returned. The rifles that survive are valued by collectors in proportion to their documentation. A Model 1873 with a known provenance, traceable to a famous owner or a documented historical event, can be worth 100 times more than an identical rifle with no story attached to it. The rifles that have lost their stories are worth, in financial terms, very little. In any other terms, they are worth perhaps more than the famous ones. They carry the silence of the people who actually lived and died on the American frontier. The people whose names did not become legends, the people whose lives were ordinary and whose deaths were ordinary, and whose passage through the country left only a tool behind. What survives, beyond the rifles themselves, is the country they helped to shape. The cattle towns that grew up around the railheads in Kansas, and the trails end in the Texas brush country, the mining camps in Colorado and Montana, and the Black Hills that became, in many cases, the cities of today. The homesteads on the plains, broken up generations ago into industrial farms, but still bearing the names of the families who first claimed them. The reservation boundaries drawn in the treaty period, which still exist, and the native nations that endured the long pressure of dispossession and that today are still here, in numbers that the men who carried Winchesters into their country could not have imagined. The towns named for the men who fought against them, the monuments raised on the battlefields, the arguments still going on over which version of the story is the right one to tell. There is something almost unsettling about how durable the rifle has been, as an object compared with the country that produced it. The New Haven factory where the Model 1873 was built is gone. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company itself, after a century and a half of corporate transformations, no longer exists in the form that Oliver Winchester knew. The men and women who worked the machines that built the rifles are gone. The cowboys and the lawmen and the warriors and the homesteaders and the outlaws who carried the rifles are gone. The horses they rode are gone. The buffalo they shot at, mostly, are gone, although small herds have been brought back in recent decades in places like the Black Hills and Yellowstone. The trail towns of the cattle drive era have, in many cases, faded into prairie dust, their main streets reduced to a single intersection and a historical marker on a stick. The forts the Army built to enforce the treaty boundaries are mostly ruins. The treaty boundaries themselves have been violated, redrawn, partially restored through litigation that is still in progress. The country that the rifle was carried into is, in almost every visible way, no longer the country it was. The rifle, more often than not, is still in working order. Cleaned and oiled in a glass case, or sold at auction every few years to a new collector, or, in a few rare cases, carried out by a modern hunter into the same kind of country it was first carried into 150 years ago. The tool has outlasted the world it was made for. It does that sometimes the way the best tools do. The Winchester Model, 1873, was present at all of it. In the saddle scabbards of the men who built the country, in the hands of the men who tried to stop them, in the closets of the women who survived in places that broke most of the men who came to them, in the photographs that fixed the era forever, in the films that softened it, in the slogans that lied about it, in the long, quiet aftermath in which the country is still trying to figure out what to do with what was done. The rifle was a tool made in a factory in Connecticut by people who never saw the country it was sent to, sold for $25, give or take, to working men and women who saved up for months to afford it, carried on the backs of horses and in the corners of cabins and on the saddles of cattle drovers across a continent, used for what it was designed to do by hundreds of thousands of people in every condition that human beings find themselves in. Some of them famous, almost all of them not. Some of them on the side of history that we now look back on with approval, many of them not. The rifle did not care, the rifle did its work. And then, when the work was done, it was set down. In some cases against a tree, in some cases on a wall, in some cases in a glass case in a museum, in some cases in a grave that nobody can find anymore. What it leaves behind is the country, and what the country has done with what it inherited is still, in 2026, a question with no settled answer. Thanks for spending time with us at Western Pioneer Archives. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Until next time, ride safe.